Hi, I'm Steve Gompertz of QRx Partners, and welcome to this week's Quality Heretic. This one might cause some conflict or some good discussion this week. We're going to talk about the concept of requirements versus specifications. Excuse me, this has been a kind of a pet peeve of mine for a long time because we tend to see these things intermix. Everybody's probably got a document, right, called requirement specifications, particularly in the software world, the SRS, the software requirement specification document. And that kind of stems back to IEEE had some standards and they kind of talked about the various deliverables in software development, and they said, yeah, this is, something you produce. ISO 9000, in its glossary didn't help with this either, because they basically refer to a specification as a document containing requirements. And my problem is they don't really work well that way. They are, in my mind, two different things, two different types of deliverables. If you think of specification as meaning a document, then yes, a specification contains the details of something. But I'm thinking about what the content is, and that from a concept, perspective, requirements are one thing and specifications are a related thing. So the way I always teach it is that the requirements are the what. What is it we have to do? We're trying to build something that can do this. That's the requirement without any indication of how. Where's the how come from? That's the specification, right? So you give your engineers the requirements, okay? And then they figure out what are your options for specifications, right? How would I accomplish that? And that's the difference. Now, it may sound like semantics, but it is important in my mind because they often get mixed, right? If we don't really define requirements as being only about the what with no how allowed at all, okay, that'll come later in the specifications. You tend to get requirements written and they're really specifications, okay? There must be a red emergency stop button. That sounds like a requirement. It's not, it's a specification. Okay. You have to kind of backtrack and go, what's the problem I'm trying to solve? Okay. The requirement is there needs to be a way to turn off the machine in an emergency. That's the requirement. You know how, just I need a way to do that. Now, engineering, go figure out the right option for doing that. And then they might specify a red button that says emergency stop or something like that. But they might think of other ways. And that's the other problem is if you don't write the requirement to stick to just the what I need, if you start to build in the how, you kind of rob engineering of its job, right? And their ability to come up with maybe a better solution than maybe you've presupposed. And that's the problem. You're kind of building your bias in. So I don't like when you put those two words together in a document title and say, this is a requirement specification. I'd rather you go, this is the requirements document. This is the specification document. They serve two very different purposes, the what, and then the how. And they get much easier to review. I've seen teams get really wrapped up on going through approving the requirements because there's so much specification baked in to what are supposed to be requirements. And then everybody gets wrapped up, right? Because then somebody goes, well, I don't think a red button's the right way to go. And then they get worked up on it. It's like, well, the problem is you haven't even defined the requirement. You're arguing over how to do it without having originally specified, I just did it there, without saying, what is it you want done? Now, show me options and we'll pick one, and then that will become the specification that we go with. So again, I understand the standards don't support me on this. They all use this what I think is conflicting terminology, but in practical, for practical reasons, you have probably seen this yourselves where people get really wrapped around the axle trying to review requirements. And it's usually because they've allowed these specifications, the how, to slip in. And now there's an argument about is that really the requirement or not? So, the next time you've got to work with requirements, challenge yourself and go, is this really just sticking to what needs to be done, or am I letting some biases in that are starting to solve the problem before the right people have even looked at it? As always, look forward to seeing what kind of comments you have. This one maybe will generate some really good discussion, but keep it professional as always, and let's hear your thoughts. Thanks. See you next week.